Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will be sharing my time with the member for Carleton. I'm pleased to rise in debate today to talk about today's opposition motion. Prior to 2015, I was in the mortgage brokerage industry. I spent 21 years in the residential mortgage brokerage business, so access to housing, to home ownership, and mortgage credit are issues that have been dear to me for many years, and they're also dear to my constituents. And there is clearly a crisis in affordable housing in Canada, in affordability generally in Canada. The average home price is now a staggering $717,000. So even if you subtract Vancouver and Toronto, the average is still $561,000 across Canada. So people have generally thought for a long time that this is a peculiarity to two markets, maybe even especially Vancouver, but that is no longer the case, Madam Speaker. Affordability is a crisis across Canada. The average weekly wage is just over $1,000. So if the average worker saved 10% of their wages, it would take them almost 10 years just to save enough for the minimum down payment on the average house in Canada. But even that would be futile, Madam Speaker, because at that income level, they wouldn't come even close to qualifying for the nearly $700,000 in mortgage debt that they would need to take on to buy this average house with this average weekly wage. So generations of Canadians have achieved a degree of financial security and independence through home ownership by buying a home probably around the time of sort of family formation and then paying it off over a generation. Well, today's young people have simply given up on that dream. And as with all questions of people's unlimited wants and needs, this really is a question of both supply and demand. Canada's increasing population has always fueled demand for housing. But since this pandemic, the Canadian interest rates have been artificially suppressed through quantitative easing, wherein the Bank of Canada buys the Canadian government's debt in order to facilitate the staggering national deficits that are triggering inflation. And this inflation is nowhere more obvious than it is in our housing markets, where we have seen an extraordinary increase in the price of real estate amid an economic contraction. So you think about that. During a once-in-a-lifetime economic contraction, housing prices actually went up. During a crisis where there's a massive collapse in economic activity, real estate is going up or has gone up. So the effect of interest rates being artificially suppressed is clearly added to the demand for housing while doing nothing to address supply. Now, what of housing supply? A recent report says that Canada lacks 1.8 million homes. That's the deficit in housing supply. Developers have complained about delays in bringing new land under development. Regulation and red tape from all three levels of government cause delay and uncertainty that restrict development. And these issues are not new, and we were approaching crisis levels long before COVID. This government now takes enormous credit for its national housing strategy, which includes its signature program that it first announced just before the 2019 election, the First-Time Home Buyers Incentive. And I want to talk about this program because as recently as during these past 2 weeks, the beginning of this Parliament, the Prime Minister has cited this program in question period in response to questions from the opposition about inflation and housing affordability. So this program was designed to help first-time homebuyers struggling to access mortgage credit under the government's so-called stress test. The stress test was actually put in the first place to try to cool the market by restricting access to mortgages. So when they realized that the people that were being punished the most by the stress test were actually first-time buyers in real estate markets other than Vancouver and Toronto, they announced this program and called it transformational, claiming that 100,000 Canadian families will achieve the dream of home ownership through this program. So under this program, a would-be home buyer who must be an absolute top-tier borrower in terms of credit eligibility and employment and whatnot, they will have had to have saved 5% down from their own resources And then they could apply to have the government also supply them with another 5%, which would have the effect of very slightly reducing the amount that they need to borrow from the bank and therefore slightly reduce their monthly payment. The borrower can repay the government back later, either when they sell the home or by paying out and discharging the government's interest in the property based on a future appraised value. So this was the government's 2019 solution for access to home ownership. This solution? I mean, this is to offer something that, you know, people who would have already qualified anyway and would have had access to mortgage credit, giving them the chance to have the government be an equity partner with them in their own home, so that when the homeowner eventually sells the property, the government gets half of the profit, but if the property goes down in value, the taxpayer shares in the loss. This was their solution to access to home ownership before the 2019 election. But they're still talking about it now as if this is somehow part of their solution to the current crisis that we're in. This program was launched just before the election. It's now entering its third year. As of July, only 9,000 Canadians had access to this program, this transformational program they claimed. Last night during Committee of the Whole, I asked the Associate Minister of Finance for an up-to-date figure. That 9,000 figure was a July figure. He had several very capable finance department officials around the table, but he chose to ignore that question, and so the July number is the most up-to-date one we have. But there's no question that this program has been a complete failure. It has not addressed really anything. It's hardly transformational. The problem of affordability and homeownership being out of reach for so many Canadians has gotten worse since, much worse since this program was announced. So today, Conservatives are proposing meaningful solutions that will actually address some of the limitations on housing supply while assuring existing homeowners and prospective homeowners that owning a principal residence, that we believe in this House affirms that it's an important foundation for stable families and communities, and the government will not tax the primary residence on its sale. So Conservatives are proposing that the federal government review and consolidate federal real estate properties and make 15% available for residential development. So we've heard today that the federal government owns tens of thousands of buildings, and these buildings are in various states of repair or disrepair, wildly varying degrees of functionality or obsolescence. Many of these buildings may not be worthwhile for, and maybe not be in the public interest for the Crown to continue to hold them. Commercial buildings have a life cycle, and the highest and best use for land varies over time. So we ask the government to take a serious look at whether it's in the public interest to continue to own many of these properties. And with large amounts of land and thousands of buildings, surely there are some that the federal government can use to add to the supply of housing to do something to arrest this out-of-control continuing inflation in real estate. Another factor limiting the supply of homes is the existence of unoccupied homes in Canada. So the Conservatives are proposing preventing foreign investors from parking their money in Canada as a place just to sit money while they have a vacant property. And for many years now, it's been widely known that Canada's real estate market has been a prime destination for wealthy foreigners to, at best, take advantage of Canada's relative stability and rule of law as a hedge on their foreign wealth, or at worst, Madam Speaker, as a haven for money laundering among the world's kleptocrats. So it's time for meaningful action. No foreign national should be permitted to buy a home in Canada just to have it sit vacant while Canadian families give up the dream of ownership. I see that I'm just about out of time, but I want to just quickly add that the Liberals have sent out mixed signals on the issue of taxing capital gains. In a recent interview with former CEO of CMHC, he talked about how and affirmed his support for such a tax. And we know that Adam Vaughan, who was this government's principal spokesman on housing issues, favored such a tax. And we know that this government will eventually have to reckon with the debt and deficits that have accumulated, that were accumulating long before the COVID crisis. And its instincts will always be to pass on these costs in new taxes. So it looks like I see you getting up, Madam Speaker. So if my time is up, then I'll let it go to questions and comments. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's fascinating to see how this day is going. We started off with Conservatives coming out here talking about 41 million acres of land. It was in the first few speeches, and now suddenly, since holes have been blown into that argument, somebody back there is scratching out 41 million acres on these speeches and writing thousands of government properties, buildings that exist. Listen, we've heard it already said in this House, and the member put forward, I think, what is a good idea for declaring surplus land available for various different purposes, but it already exists. As we heard the Parliamentary Secretary say earlier, it already exists in the form of a land bank through the Federal Land Initiative. So can the member, comment on why his speech has suddenly adapted this, or the speeches in the House have suddenly adapted this tone of thousands of buildings, making them available when this already exists?
Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Is it the member, is he asserting that they are successfully managing their 30, I think I heard in the member for Edmonton Riverbend speech, 37,000 buildings, that this has been a successful management and that they have succeeded in ensuring that buildings that have reached the end of their life cycle or no longer are functional for their intended purposes or meet the correct best in use of land, that they are succeeding in transitioning these lands for private development. Is that his assertion? I would suggest that he vote in favor of this motion and commit to 15%.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The motion itself does not talk about social housing. We understand the objective is to increase the offer, which is deficient. I would like my colleague to say whether, in fact, social housing is included in the Conservative Party's motion.
For Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, when a motion comes out, I think it's always tough when you then go ahead and talk about all the things that it could have said in addition to the things that it actually says. But the member is correct, I think, in terms of drawing attention to many of the deficiencies of the government on housing. This motion and my remarks on this motion primarily address the failure of supply and the role that the federal government can play in increasing the supply of real estate available for development and for sale for Canadians to buy.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech. He said he had a background in real estate. We've had the Conservatives here who have refused to accept the NDP amendment to this motion that would specifically ask for non-market housing, for affordable housing. And as an example, another member of the Conservative Party just brought up an example of what a building we could use was in downtown Toronto, like right across from Union Station. I'm just wondering if he could perhaps opine on what a condo in such a building would cost.
Well, Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, I think that a new development in that particular location would add to the overall supply and would put a damper on the endless increase in demand. I mean, the condo building that the member for Wellington Halton Hills spoke about would add to the supply and would throughout the market would have a positive effect on affordability. This is the problem. We have demand that's being fueled in part by this government's deficits, which are being facilitated through quantitative easing. We need to get past that. We need to increase supply and quit pouring gasoline on demand.
Quick question from the Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It was, I often watch on TV and show up here in the chamber and just feel sorry for the member from Kingston in the Islands. Today, again, tying himself directly to the Kathleen Wynne government, like Throw him a bone, Prime Minister. Please help this member. He sits there in the back benches, continues to heckle. But what I wanted to address is something that the member from Winnipeg North mentioned about our motion, and it was to remove Part C, which is a capital gains tax piece. I'm curious of the member from Vancouver Granville. I haven't heard from him speak yet today. I wonder what he thinks of that particular motion.
A very, very brief answer from the honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, it sounded like there were some questions for a few other members there, but yeah, it's that third part of the motion. That was an interesting response that we had from the member for Winnipeg North. It seems that the
We will have to leave it at that and resume debate with the